Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast. Angus, our engineer, tells me this is episode 207. So if you followed along, you've listened to a hell of a lot of Ancient Warfare talk. With me today are Lindsay Powell, Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, and Murray Dahm. And we're going to talk about Hadrian's Wall because we're talking about other fortifications in the next issue of Ancient Warfare, which is finally done. And our sister magazine, Ancient History, is going to talk about Hadrian's Wall. But since it's kind of a military topic, we figured we'd talk about it anyway. And there's definitely some things. We have a few questions, and I'm sure we can come up with some other ones to ask ourselves to keep ourselves busy. Lindsay, as you've written the introduction in Ancient History, I happen to know sort of at least the chronological introduction to Hadrian's Wall. Could you give us a sort of minimized version of that? So that people know
really?
where it
You want
comes
a minimized version? You could write a whole book about this
people
stuff.
need to buy this copy of Ancient History. Come on.
Well, I was going to say, isn't that the plug? Please buy issue 40. It's terrific. Okay, so we're talking Emperor Hadrian, right? So AD 117 when he exceeds from Trajan, and he dies in 138. So we're talking about the years in between. And why are we talking about Hadrian's Wall today? Well, there's a general consensus that in AD 122, work on the wall started. So this happens to be the 1900th anniversary. And if you live between Newcastle and Carlisle, you have lots of interesting things to do between now and the end of the year, culminating in a Saturnalia. So, it'll all be great fun for you folks up there. And the rest of us will just have to watch on YouTube and things. So what's intriguing about the whole Hadrian's Wall phenomenon is we think we know a lot about it, but actually we remarkably don't. We seem to have lots of ideas of what it was built for, but there's only one statement in the ancient texts, which I'm going to read here, which is actually from the Historia Augusta in the book about Hadrian, where it quotes, Hadrian was the first to build a wall 80 Roman miles long to separate the Romans from the barbarians. And that's the only thing apparently written about the structure that survives from the ancient world. And yet it spawns a whole great many theories as to why the wall was built the way it was built. It seems to have been, assuming that it was built in AD 122, that very rapidly it sort of underwent a re-engineering. So the original architecture, which seems to have been a ditch on the north side, a wall which had mile castles literally every mile, with two turrets in between, was superseded by a design which inserted 17 forts, auxiliary forts principally, which could be cavalry or could be infantry or even a mix, along the length, which then begs the question, well, why would you do that? So in other words, what was the underpinning military strategy for the wall? And I think that's something that we can explore tonight. The interesting thing is, of course, that Hadrian's name is associated with it. And as we were talking this in the preview beforehand, the succeeding source is actually ascribed to other people, which is itself a fascinating case of how does history get written. It was very quickly superseded in about 25 years by the Antonine Wall. And then 25 years later, it then became the northern frontier again. So it indicates a shifting policy vis-a-vis Roman frontier strategy. So that's a fascinating line of inquiry. Then you've got the whole, what was the context for it? And what I explore in the article in Ancient History, which was fascinating to me, is that by the time Hadrian arrives in AD 122, and he's touring the empire at this point, running across the German provinces and through what we now call the Netherlands, and ending in Britain, is that, in fact, the empire is not at peace. So, in fact, when he exceeds Trajan in AD 117, there are already Jewish revolts right across the empire in places like Cyprus and Egypt and Syene, for example. That's very quickly suppressed. And then very quickly, then a rebellion breaks out in Mauritania. So that's in North Africa. And now we have echoes in the ancient texts, again, the Scriptoria Historia Augusta, that there is trouble in Britain. The problem is we don't know whether there was a rebellion before Hadrian arrived, while he was there, or after. There are some people think that there was a rebellion around about 119, and that was the year that the wall was started, in which case, when Hadrian arrived in 122, he was visiting a structure being built. There is some evidence maybe that the casualties caused in the conflict between Romans and Britons was so extensive that, in fact, Fronto writing, I think it's to, is it Marcus Aurelius, mentions that the casualties were enormous in this catastrophe that happened in Britain. So we also have archaeological evidence, for example, in London, of a layer of fire, which has nothing to do with Boudica. It actually is contemporary with Hadrian's. It's around about 125, 126. So it may well be that this wall was built in wartime. But again, we don't know. There are also there are inscriptions which refer to a wonderful thing called the Expeditio Britannica, which translates as a British task force. And we know that vexillations were brought from mainland Europe, from Germany and Pannonia, other places, to actually fight, presumably in the north of Britain, but not necessarily. They could have been elsewhere. And this is the problem. So what I'm trying to communicate to people is the idea that we have somehow that the wall was built in a sort of peaceful world may in fact not be the case at all. It may in fact have been built as a result of an insurrection, maybe. It might have been built during one. And it may have actually spawned another in the process of this. And I think what it highlights is much as we think we know a lot about Hadrian's Wall, the reality is we don't.
Yeah. The fun part is that to realize maybe is that you mentioned the Scriptoris Historia Augusta, the narrative histories that we're very used to for the first century, from Tacitus, from relatively complete bits in Dio, Suetonius, Plutarch, and then we get into the second century, and then almost all of them are gone, except for the very, very problematic Scriptoris Historia Augusta, which has been made out from everything between, barely a, gossip journalism to made up crap to completely reliable histories and everything in between.
As an example of that, for example, what I was going to say is that, because you asked me the question actually when I was writing the article. So why was it that Hadrian seems to have changed imperial policy from one being of outright expansionism? I mean, all the way from the earliest times, Rome is basically an accretive city-state, and it keeps adding places. And ultimately you get through to Augustus, and of course he has a very aggressive policy of wars of both of choice and also of necessity, and the successive emperors go after it. But under Hadrian, it's very clear there's a turnaround, there's a complete reverse of that policy. And I'm reminded that, for example, he very quickly abandons Trajan's conquests in the eastern part, in nominally Parthia. And in fact, what they say in the SHA is the Parthians always regarded him as a friend, which of course could be a joke, because if you give something back to the Parthians, that's not a thing you want to be proud of, right? So what I'm saying is that the source, you're quite right, is one that you can't really rely on, because in fact it could be tongue-in-cheek. But unfortunately, it's the only one to mention the wall in the context of Hadrian. And that's what we've got. And it's the one that tells us. I
was just going to add, we have this lack of written sources. And for the same period, we have the very famous monuments. We have Trajan's Column, which is, the narrative sources that we have relatively minimal. We have Hadrian's Wall, a huge thing everybody knows. And but how to explain it? I'm sure we can talk about that.
I think the thing that again, and I know that Mark DeSantis has been reading as well, is that it's a structure that had several iterations. I mean, part of it was built in timber and turf, and different parts of it were different widths and presumably different heights. And it sounds like, in a sense, there may have been a nominal architectural theme which got changed, and different of the legions which were sent up, which of course were stationed in Britain. That would be the 2nd Augusta, the 20th Valeria Victrix, the 6th Victrix, and I think there might be another one. But the point is, it wasn't the 9th at this point. Is that they were assigned lengths of wall, and we had these centurial stones where we know that particular centurial units were building a stretch, which is fascinating because, obviously these men are, using their technical skills and building this thing. But in a sense, it doesn't sound like it was project managed to be an absolute uniform, visually the same thing in its actual building. And some part of it came down to, I guess, that they prioritized maybe certain areas. I don't know whether they built it from the coast inwards or they started in the middle outwards or what they did. And this is one of the interesting things. If people go to YouTube and actually look at Archaeology, Hadrian's Wall, Matthew Simmons, there's a fascinating lecture that he gives there, where he basically says, and this is what's interesting, is that the consensus seems to be the wall was either built as basically a block to north-south movement, or it was built as a means to regulate and control that movement. And in fact, there were many gates along the route as well, and each of the mile castles normally had a gateway that way. But the other aspect is it underpins or reveals maybe the military strategy, which was one for counterinsurgency. So what you could actually do is launch military missions. And what's fascinating is that mile castles and the turrets are behind the wall. Each of those 17 forts, which were added after the World War began, actually straddle the wall. So part of it, 3 of the gates are actually on the north side, which tells you that the idea is that they're supposed to be egress. They're supposed to be access outwards of troops, many of which are going to be cavalry. So it's actually fascinating. Do we see here, for example, one military strategy, which may have been inspired by Hadrian at some point, and then as the legionary legates and their camp prefects were saying, there's a better way to deal with this, or actually they start encountering, for example, if there indeed was this big tumult that happened, that they realized, in fact, a different approach was needed. They need to attack the enemy before it comes down.
Again, we've got a little problem with that in a number of the cases of those, they sort of come across as like sally ports going out in terms of, strike forces, but then they're blocked up very soon after, a number of them. And it seems like they have another change of heart in terms of what the actual purpose is. I mean, we've also got a big problem in terms of we've been talking about what we don't know. We don't know about exactly what is happening in that exact area in the 30 years before Hadrian's Wall exists. We know that you've got the campaigns of Agricola into the north and whatnot. You've got the retreat coming back due to Domitian. But then it's very difficult to see. There's probably the establishment of Carlisle and Corbridge are established sometime in that period. But again, it's a period of we don't know exactly what is happening along that Staingate area and whether there is actually some sort of precursor at all before the actual wall goes in there. And if so, is there something, is there a policy that's being applied there beforehand? I mean, in terms of the movement of people, you mentioned the mile castles and whatnot, but of course, after the wall was built, there is also, we mentioned also the ditch to the north of the wall. And of course, that sort of goes round the forts straddling straddling the wall. And it also means that in order to get across that ditch, there are particular crossing points that are made, and those crossing points correspond with the 17 forts as such, not necessarily the mile castles. So therefore, it's like a channeling of people, channeling of any movement through that region into particular region or particular areas, something that sort of corresponds with other walls that are built at roughly the same time in other areas of the empire, such as in Tunisia. So, again, that sort of suggests more of, some sort of, a policing action or a customs action rather than a purely military.
What we have to get out of is a sort of 21st century idea of a frontier being a fixed demarcation. I mean, those of us who live in the United States, of course, are very aware of the Mexico-US border and how we're going to build a giant wall with, gates and all the rest of it. I don't think you can look at the Roman Empire in that sort of term. Frontiers are really zones that they're areas which are somewhat fuzzy, and they're partly determined by natural things like rivers or valleys or mountains or deserts. And then there'll be forts, presumably where the Roman army has decided that it's a good strategic place to put a fort. And really, as long as the people are prepared to march out of the fort and defend an area, that's where the frontier is. If they decide they're not going to do that, then the frontier pulls back closer to the fort. You see what I'm saying? So the wall, in a sense, is one attempt at least. And if you take the Scriptoria Historia Augusta, literally, Hadrian was the first to build a wall to separate Romans from barbarians. That hints at a sort of, and this is what I argue in ancient history, it echoes almost Augustus's philosophy. Having lived through 40, 50 years of expanding, he decides there's no benefit in doing that anymore. You just have to basically collapse down to rivers and oceans and mountains and deserts, and that's what's defensible. And anything beyond that's futile. And what Hadrian does is maybe to recognize that, and then his successors, Antoninus Pius and who the other people are, maybe have a rethink, and they don't think. Plus, of course, the provincial governor, who is a legate in his own way, who's responsible for the peace and security of the province, is at liberty, presumably, to actually change things in order to develop a policy that fulfills that.
I think it's clear that the wall itself served as a counter-raid barrier. That is, if you were a Caledonian raiding party and you were trying to steal something, some sort of loot from inside the Britannia province, it would have been very hard to get it back over the wall. It was a difficult thing to get your whatever material you had over a wall that would have been defended, at least in some part, all along its length. I do wonder about the wall, what it represents in terms of Roman strategy for the entire island of Britain, in that with Roman frontiers, I mean, you could always keep pushing the frontiers on and on and on, and then you have to move it further and further to defend it. And I understand that Augustus said at some point, we'll keep it at a river or mountains or some barrier like that. But the Romans certainly did know that Britain was an island and that a large chunk of the island lay outside of their direct control. Why is it that the Romans never determined to conquer the whole of Britain? What was it that they did not believe necessary? Because Agricola had campaigned for several years and had won a great battle at Mons Graupius. Why did they not try to bring the entirety of the island under their control?
I think it comes down to business, doesn't it? In terms of what you can make out of your conquest. And in pure, simple terms, the North was not profitable enough.
See, I wonder, so Mark, you said before the podcast went live about you'd read the Agricola, and I think one of the things there is that the subtext is that my uncle was great. It was Domitian was the evil, nasty dude who upset everything. And in fact, because he was jealous, he pulls Agricola back from that. And then the Staingate presumably becomes the sort of northern frontier. But it doesn't, don't forget, I mean, Antoninus Pius moves the frontier up. So there is an ambition to conquer the island. Septimus Severus comes to the island in what we said, 628. And actually, then there's a whole string of campaigns going on over several years, and he finally dies in Eboracum, at which point it sounds like the Romans finally give up. But what I think is that at the time of Hadrian, he makes, or one of his commanders makes a strategic determination. A wall is the right thing to build at that moment in time. And again, going back to the ancient sources, for example, a couple of things I wanted to point out. The Britons could not be kept under Roman sway, 5.2 under the Historia Augusta. So something's going on, and they must determine the practical solution is build a wall, keep them separate, right? Like a riot shield would be. Interesting also, in 21.8 in the same book, there were no campaigns, expeditiones, of importance during his reign, and the wars, bella, that he did wage were brought to a close almost without a rousing comment. Now, if that's not a witty comment and is actually deadly serious, it would seem to suggest that the Romans didn't actually think of what was going on in Britain as being particularly important. It was a local affair. You build a wall, we move on.
Or Judea, as you would probably add.
Well, don't forget that was later. So that's exactly 10 years later. And that's an interesting.
Yep.
Which the quote said.
So, but that's interesting why, of course, it could be a joke. Everybody knows there were lots of wars, and in fact, the joke is on Hadrian because he was a man of education and peace, and in fact, never achieved it.
If you're saying that though, and you're saying it's a backwater, and therefore it's just a local action, then you just one question I would raise is there are those other fortifications, in the frontiers that are being made at roughly the same time under Hadrian's rule. The Limes in Germany is not as complex a barrier necessarily as what is built in Britannia. Does that not indicate something of, that there is more of a necessity for whatever purpose you want to ascribe to the wall? Is there not more of a necessity in Britannia rather than on the northern frontier in Germania?
There's no river. There's no Rhine in the north of Britain. You can, there are many fordable rivers in that area. Although, again, when the Antonine Wall gets pushed forward, it's at a more logical, narrower point in Scotland than where, the Hadrian's Wall is between Carlisle and Newcastle today. So but the idea that they keep pushing forward is that good old Roman thing of exceeding what's gone on in the past, even when you've gone to such immense effort to build a wall of such, 70 Roman miles long, such a height. If to suddenly abandon that and go forward a bit more is part of that sort of excessiveness of Romans going, well, we've done better than our ancestors. And there's campaigns, and then there's a retreat back to Hadrian's Wall eventually in the early 3rd century.
So my suggestion is this: I think it's important to recognize that again, the frontiers weren't sort of international in a way that we understand frontiers, and moreover, the army was broken up by provincial grouping. So there was an army, Exercitus Britannica. There was a British army, and there was a army of Germania Superior and Inferior and Noricum and all the other places. And they're commanded by the local provincial governor, who's a legatus Augusti pro praetore. And I have to imagine that a lot of discretion is given to that individual to determine lots of things of policy within the broader framework of your job is to keep the peace, to look after Roman citizens that are here and, maintain the integrity and bring in the tax revenues and those types of things. So it's quite possible that and we've been talking about the limes, for example, in limes in Germania Superior, which was basically an oak palisade with watchtowers. So there's no walkway. There's just basically this really thick log fence that runs the length of that place, in complete contrast to what's happening in northern Britain. And you could argue that some part of it's geography, right? Maybe there are not a lot of oak trees in northern England. There's plenty of stone. We're going to use that as our building material. And yet there are parts of the wall which are made of timber and turf. As far as I know, the limes in Germania Superior at this time was only made of timber. It wasn't made of stone. But in later iterations, as the limes of the different sections were built out, they reflected any number of different things. So I think Hadrian's Wall is a Romano-British, if I use the words very carefully, a Roman-British solution to a local problem. And they expressed it in a highly sophisticated way. And in part, I think, it's because they had 3 going on 4 legions available, no doubt with camp prefects who had brilliant ideas about what a great idea would be. And ultimately, of course, it's manned by auxiliaries. So that's another facet of this whole thing. So I've read somewhere that it took about 15,000 men to build over about 6 to 8 years and about 9,700 men to man it. So it was always a very expensive thing to do. But what else were you going to do with the troops anyway? They had to be somewhere.
Just to compare a bit more, I mean, the area that you're talking about in Germania Superior, that is a stretch between the upper part of the Rhine and the upper part of the Danube. Right, that's the area that we're talking about, because of course the rest of the northern frontier, that's all either the Rhine or the Danube, and that's relatively easy to control because you have there's various watchtowers, there's legions at various places, and there are fleets to patrol the rivers to keep an eye on what's going in and out. There's no real fixed frontier. We have to assume that if a large raiding party wants to get across, they can, but they might get caught going in or coming out. And it's certainly there's actually for another reason in the upcoming issue of Ancient Warfare, we have a photo of an inscription from September 11th, 260 AD, AD 260, where the governor of Raetia celebrates a victory over a large raiding party that has come back from northern Italy, and they've gone in through the limes unobserved, or they were not capable of catching them. But by the time they come back with all their loot and their slaves, the Roman army intercepts them and puts an end to that party. And that was interesting enough to put up an inscription. That might say something about the defense of the empire, certainly in the 3rd century. And if we follow Ludwig, by then it's already changing.
This is why it's fascinating, because I think, once again, it exposes that we think we know, but actually we know very little, actually, as it turns out.
No, I was just
the questions are fascinating.
I don't know off the top of my head how long that German limes is, but I think if you count up the number of legions that are backing that area, we normally think of Britain as a single province with a relatively large army, which is true, but the army is fairly spread out throughout the province. If you look at Germania Superior, Raetia, Noricum, there might, I don't know about, it'd be interesting if we had a map of where the legions are at this time. There might be quite a few in a fairly small stretch to,
I think they're
have a flexible backup to that palisade.
They're still traditionally in Caerleon, Chester, and York, and then the auxiliaries man the wall. But I think the interesting thing is that in the 3rd century, you do start to get the idea of an army reacting to an event rather than preventing an event by their presence, which then, of course, leads to the 4th century or late 3rd century Comatensis and Limitanes armies. And so the idea of the zone becomes more sort of relevant because you have the idea that they're in a zone. If you attack, then your Limitanes can offer, well, token resistance really, or and then the Comatenus will come and react to that invasion. And it's also interesting that whenever Britain revolts from the empire, so 197 with Clodius Albinus, and then in the 260s and then in the 270s, there seems to be a reaction of punishing Britain by splitting it into first 2 provinces. And again, like with so many other things at this period of British history, we don't know where the split between Britannia and Britannia Secundae is. But then later in the century, it gets split into 5, even 6. We don't have 6 names, but we get given the number 6 provinces. And then at some point in the 4th century, we get a new province again called Valeria being added to Britain. So it could be that there are 7 separate provinces of Britain by the time Britain leaves the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So the issue there, of course, is that, well, hang on a minute, which one's what? And then, of course, you've got the Notitia, which gives us 3 British commands, not 5, 6, 7 provinces. And those commands are very peculiar because we've obviously got the Saxon Shore, which we're discussing in the current issue. You've then got the Dux Britanniae, who commands 37 forts, which is just ridiculous. And then you've got the Comes Britanniae as well. So, sorry, it's the Dux Britannorum, Dux Britannorum.
Latin, right?
Britannia. Yeah. So, those are really amazingly complex commands over a vast period of time with no sources to tell us about them. And it's almost like there is a changing attitude towards what the wall would have represented, because in the later sources, when you read Gildas and Bede and Nennius and anything based on them, the wall is definitely a barrier to keep out Pictish raids. And the decline of Britain and Gildas is all about the fact that the army either won't leave their forts or they abandon the wall and leave the north to the raids of the Picts and the Scots.
Yet we're devoid of any archaeological evidence of any such defense or any such attacks and whatnot. Even when you've got the Great Barbarian Conspiracy, it seems that Hadrian's Wall seems to have got off scot-free, whereas the rest of the island has fallen to barbarian incursions.
So the wall is 80 Roman miles, but in fact, there are forts and watchtowers all the way down the Cumbrian coast, for example, as well. So it's more like a cap rather than a wall, right? So the funny thing about the film Arthur, of course, is that the Saxons coming down just go around the side kind of thing, which makes great movie making, I suppose, but actually is historically incorrect. But so the Romans already knew that was the weakness, so they built more fortifications, and the whole area is highly militarized as well. And what's also interestingly the case, and I think we cover it in one of the news stories in the present issue, is how the tribes north of the wall sort of settled, and there's a pretty even distribution of farmsteads, as indeed there's on the other side as well. So in effect, that the wall exists in a militarized zone with the sort of stasis happening between the people north and south of it. So what happens? I mean, with this, we just talked about this big sort of rebellion. I mean, what happens to trigger these people is a whole different discussion. But the wall does seem to survive for about 300 years. It goes all the way through the 6th century. You look at Hafsteds, for example, and you see the rebuilding of the barrack blocks. They go from these divided individual units in barrack blocks to becoming little houses where mixed marriages and all sorts of things going on in those aspects.
Do you see any worthwhile analogy that can be made between the frontier zone around the wall, the Hadrian's Wall, and the relations between the Romans and the Caledonian tribes, and what we see in the frontier in Germany at roughly the time of Teutoburger Wald, where the Romans had wanted to expand across the Rhine and into further into Germany, but ultimately were dissuaded because of the disaster of Varus, and maybe they had something relatively similar happen to them in North Britain in the the 1-teens, the 120s, and that wall is either precipitated by the crisis or it precipitated a crisis itself. What do we see there? And is it any relation to the disappearance of the 9th Legion, Hispano Legion?
There's a lot of assumption made by, I think, a lot of historians writing about the wall, in that that we've got nothing concrete to say that the wall spawns any local uprisings or any attacking of the troops as they're trying to build the wall, etc. But I think a lot of the historians just assume that that would be the natural thing to do, that the local population would resist in some way. So we must assume, but we've got no evidence of that.
Apart from this comment where they talk about the Britons could not be kept under Roman sway, and all that. So clearly there's something going on.
But again, that's not indicating local in that area. It's not giving it a location. It's just generalizing across Britannia there. And again, in terms of an uprising in the south, if there's an uprising in the south that Hadrian's reacting to, why has he got 3 legions, the 6th, the 20th, and the 2nd, plus 2 detachments of the 22nd, I think it is, and the 8th, all building a wall in the north? It seems mighty, neglectful of anything that might have happened in the south in the recent time.
Well, so what I'm reading here, you're talking about CAL 105829 equals ILS 2726. So it states that Titus Pontius Sabina was overseer, praepositus of 3 military detachments of what you just said there, which would be 7th Gemina, 9th Hispana, from Hispana, the 8th Augusta and the 22nd Primigenia in Germania Superior. And they are on the British task force. So once again, we come to this enigmatic thing, the Expeditio Britannica. We don't quite know when it happened. Was it 119, for example? Was it in the middle 120s? But they didn't build a wall. The cantorial stones don't refer to those. The ones they refer to are the 6th, the 2nd, and the 20th, and the 20th. Yeah. I wanted to go back to Mark's case, which was the other Mark, about Teutoburg and so on. The policy of Augustus was interesting because it was a combination of treaty allies. So, for example, several of the tribes on the other side of the Rhine were actually treaty allies, including the Cherusci. So the big surprise for them is that, in fact, they end up by falling out with the Cherusci because they thought, hold on, this guy's an ally. Why is he doing what he's doing? And that's, of course, how Arminius was able to leverage his position because he was supposed to be a trusted ally. I'm not sure that that's still the policy by the time you get to Hadrian. In fact, whether there are any allies north of the wall. I mean, the supposition seems to be there was a certain kind of they artificially create a sort of neutral zone by depopulating the Watardini and so on. I don't know if there's any evidence for that, except the fact that they have these farmsteads which have been recently seen by crop circles and the markings in the ground, and they're going to be excavating some of those in due course. So there is, in that 100 years that elapsed between Augustus and Hadrian, maybe there's a policy change. But what Augustus was able to do was play very interestingly, which of course Claudius could do when he invaded Britain in AD 43. He was able to rely on the Regini or the Regni, that the Regnenses, the tribe under normally Togodumnus, to be able to hold that peace. They didn't have to conquer West Sussex because that was already an ally, and they could move in from there. And then they assumed at some point that the Iceni and the Brigantes were themselves allies, and then we later see that of course is not the case. So I think the policy changes.
Also, I mean, it's often said that in response to the Teutoburg Forest, that the Romans start to fortify the Rhine frontier, but the evidence suggests that only happens in the reign of Claudius. So that's almost 3 decades later that the Rhine frontier starts to get fortified.
Well, don't forget. So Tiberius, so Augustus actually sends Germanicus ostensibly to reconquer Germany, right? So we're talking again 114. Then of course Tiberius takes over, and Tiberius could have actually heeded the advice of Augustus, which supposedly was, keep the borders as they are. But no, what he does, he allows Germanicus to go back for another 2 campaigns in 15 and 16. which of course ends up with Anglo-Bavarian Wall and various other battles. And in the end, that's where Tiberius says, enough, you're coming back to Rome, celebrate your triumph, and then go off.
Then there's another revolt of the Frisi in 28.
Still being pushed forward under Domitian. There's still Limes building happening under Domitian.
Yeah.
In Germania.
In fact, a war. He tries supposedly to take Germany, which is why he becomes Germanicus in his coins. He claims that war title.
Oh no, he definitely won it, because it's just that Domitian gets damnatio memoria, because we've got the inscriptions of Frontinus's governorship. He's governor of Germany from 82 to 84, and he is the best literary source for those campaigns in his own stratagems. So it's just that there was a point. I think it was who was it? Brian Jones wrote in Domitian that one of the problems that Domitian's wars has, which is something that Trajan counters with the column, is that those were wars of little evidence. There were no spoils, there was no gold, there was nothing else coming back. And so it was all kind of like, well, what's going on? And there's also the argument, of course, that that's happening in Britain too, that there's not the resources to show for conquest. And so the conquest is stopped. And the interesting thing with that, of course, is that people will talk about how Britain is a resource for the rest of the empire later. And it's like, well, yes, but where's your evidence? And there's one campaign under Julian where he seems to be supplying the Rhine legions with supplies from Britain. But there is, in fact, a passage in the Panegyrici Latini, which is one of those sources that many military historians don't read, which talks about a land so abundant in crops, so rich in the number of its pastures, so overflowing with veins of ore, so lucrative in venues, so girt with harbors. And that's describing Britain as a resource for the rest of the empire. And so I wonder whether the wall is in fact trying to protect that, because one of the things that's interesting about the breakaway empires in Britain, none of them are centered on the wall. They're all centered on the southeast coast. So the breakaway of Britain is either paired with Gaul or it's the south. It's never the north. There's never a breakaway empire of Hadrian's Wall centered, which has got forts aplenty. If you want to break away, you've got a whole bunch of stuff to break away with up there, but that's never the breakaway center. And so it's possible that they are protecting the rich resources of Britain. And one of the reasons, again, which we'll talk about when we talk about the current issue, is that the forts on the southern coast could be logistic centers to export material from Britain back to the rest of the empire.
Apparently, Roman legionaries in the 2nd century BC were relatively unwilling to go serve in Spain because there was relatively little loot that could be gained by fighting the Iberian tribesmen. The preference was to go fight wars in Greece, where wealthy cities and there was stuff to take. Can we say safely that perhaps fighting in North Britain against the British tribes, or perhaps against the German tribes to the east of the Rhine, were unappealing wars for the very reason that there was less booty to be had, and therefore the wall or whatever barriers the Romans used at various times, such as the limes in Germany, were this is how we'll keep them out and just leave it at that, and that's why they didn't engage in further wars of conquest?
Well, Mark, in a way, I think that there is something in that, and again, if we think that it was legionaries who built the wall, but it was auxiliaries that manned it, the legions, as Murray pointed out earlier, were in Caerleon, in Chester, and York. And of course, they were on manoeuvres, and they were out in middle of Wales and up the Pennines and all sorts of places. But the point is, it does seem to be that they didn't send legionaries once they built Hadrian's Wall to man it. It was somebody else's, arguably a lower grade truce. Controversial. So there must be something in it.
It's amazing, actually, that they didn't have some sort of, not an uprising necessarily, but I mean, in terms of, some disgruntled legionaries really in those years building a wall, when you sort of think about the amount of time that they're spending on one project in one location, very little in terms of profit in their eyes, probably as soldiers, and looking at, casting an eye across the waters to other legions in other frontiers who might be actually, engaging in warfare that might be viewed as a little bit more profitable. So
my suggestion that is something I sort of explored in the article for Ancient History, number 40, coming out soon. was the idea that when Hadrian basically changes the policy of expansionism, says we're basically securing the frontiers, we're locking down with what we've got. The army can no longer look to spoils of war because there's not going to be these great expeditions overseas. The focus is renewed towards internal security. So that's a different set of priorities. And the results must be that you've got to occupy the troops in a different way. You've still got as many of them. 360,000, I think, was the estimate between the legionaries and the auxiliaries at the time. Humongous size of workforce to employ. So you can employ them usefully if they're not doing police duty. And the assumption here is, of course, Britain's peaceful. So what you've got to do is find them other things to do, and building a wall is a perfectly fine, productive thing for them to build. On the other hand, if you overlay on the fact that there is actually turmoil and problem in the province, building a wall is part of the solution. And maybe it's because it's the Brigantes who maybe are the cause of that. I don't have any evidence for that, but that's what I see in some of the reports here. And they may be being supported by the Watadini and the other people. I forget who they are. There were the two tribes just north of the wall. And the Staingate, as it was basically a porous border. I mean, they could come up and down, and there would be nothing to stop them. Building the wall goes back to this idea of dividing barbarians from Romans, and it's a clear demarcation line. Although they do provide, if you have a legitimate business, you can come through the designated spots, and they'll do whatever they need to do to let you pass. So I just wonder if that's a point too.
The Romans could also control the export of weaponry north of the wall because they controlled all of the crossing points.
It's an interesting idea just to ponder upon. I think just in terms of how quickly or how slowly the legionaries' point of view would change under with Hadrian's a change of policy like Hadrian's. Are they traditionalist, or is it does the recruitment allow for the changing of mentality in a quick fashion?
The Vindolander tablets and the other tablets from other forts of similar ilk don't seem to talk of disgruntlement. They do seem to talk of send me some socks. Have you got any oysters? What's going on? There's
that's the auxiliary. So but that's what I'm saying.
But there's not any evidence of disgruntlement of, oh my God, I'm so bored. This is terrible. This is the worst.
They're coming from a climate that's similar, at least in the case of the Batavians.
So I think it's a really interesting frontier life settles down to hurry up and wait.
There's a point at which, particularly in the East, Hadrian recognizes there are some bad behaviors that have crept in. And again, the historian Augusta points to the fact that the troops got to like him because he was a soldier's soldier. And he would, there's a famous inscription, which was actually an edition of Ancient Warfare many issues ago. Was it Duncan Campbell, I think, where he talks about this inscription basically is extracts from a speech where he's praising the cavalry riders for they do these wonderful maneuvers.
That was in the special, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I think what you find is Hadrian is touring the empire, and he does the years on years and years. And interestingly enough, the western and the northwestern provinces are the first ones he goes. Once he's established himself in Rome. So 121, 122, he's in the British Isles. And the fact is, again, the policy is sent through his command structure. And I think what's interesting is the Vindolander letters are very interesting because they illustrate the degree to which people are communicating back and forth informally. So you can imagine what the formal communications must be like. Your mission is to do this. And even the letters between Pliny and Trajan, which the regime before, where you've got the governor actually going to the emperor, say, "I need your advice on this," and then the rescript comes back and say, "Don't hunt down the Christians. It's not what we do in our day." So I think that there's a case to be argued here where the emperor changes the policy, and within a reasonably short period of time, that is communicated to the periphery and it's acted upon. Discipline is the underpinning of the Roman army in all cases.
And I think you can't underestimate, as you're saying, Lindsay, I think, the emperor is going and visiting all these bases, or at least a lot of them, and maybe personally communicating this change of, if there's a change in policy that can, to emphasize the importance, him going himself and explaining it to his soldiers, who knows?
you can almost imagine him saying, that the rewards you will get will not be like your forefathers, where you got gold talks from Caledonians, but you will get, on the other hand, years of service, glory, and all the other good stuff.
And then you get to go to Judea, and well, that's different.
Yeah, Julius Severus, etc. Yeah, well, but that's very interesting. That maybe this is the point we end on, is the fact that if Hadrian's whole idea was containment and build walls and so on, ultimately didn't work. Because in Judea, as the case in point, there's a 3.5-year rebellion, which is pretty bloody. And in the same letter that I alluded to, where Fronto is writing about a great many Romans were killed by Britons, a great many Romans were killed by Jews, and that's in the same sentence. So these two things are blemishes on Hadrian's reputation. And when he dies, his successors immediately change the policy. They start expanding again.
And it's always, something that we don't commemorate enough. This empire contains, what, by estimate, 50 million people, and a good part of Europe, and it's controlled by an army of 450,000 soldiers. That's, if you think about it, really not that many, especially if they have to walk everywhere if there's an emergency. Yeah, but it might not be strange that they experiment with various ways of locking down certain areas.
I think the fascinating thing for me is that when you look at those later sources, what we would call early medieval sources, they have no idea about the wall in terms of who built it, what it was for. They assign it to Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century. Some of them even assign it to Aetius in the 5th century, that when they ask for help and he doesn't give it, they build the wall then. So it's like, in the Bede, writing in the early 8th century, can talk about the wall being built once the groans of the Britons have been ignored by the then Emperor of Rome in 450, roughly. They build the wall then. It's like, well, actually, no, the wall by that point was already 300 years old. How do you not know that the wall was there already?
Ever since Bede, we've really not advanced that much.
That's a very interesting point. Bring up about the nature of historical memory, because apparently the Teutoburger Wall disaster was forgotten about for over 1,000 years and was only recalled when Tacitus was rediscovered in the early 16th century.
Do you know who it was that then actually leveraged the whole story of Hermann? It was Martin Luther, and it was all part of his struggle against the Roman Catholic Church, and actually ultimately the foundation of a German state. So it's interesting. It has long-term repercussions.
And they still have a Teutoburger Wall in Germany. And if you go, what was it I saw? Was reminded on today that there are reviews. I forget whether it was on Yelp or something else, but Augustus didn't like it, and neither did Varus. They all gave it only 1 star.
I do find it interesting that such a critical battle could be forgotten for so long. But I think that is the nature of the point. That is, the wall went up, and I'm sure that there are many people who knew precisely when it went up, but then generations later, that knowledge is forgotten.
I might point to what we said earlier, and we're starting to repeat ourselves, so it's definitely time to wrap it up. But, if we see that in the generations post-construction of the wall, it seems that the purpose changes, or different emperors change things around, then clearly the idea of the wall doesn't stick either. And therefore, centuries later, we don't know what it's about and what it's for.
Well, then it becomes a great source of ready quarried stone. Let's build our house.
Anybody who's up in the north part of England, Cumbria or Northumbria, they should actually look up the website that tells them about the activities. Lots of things happening. In fact, many of the Roman sites have got reenactors performing different things. Military Guard's going to be there, for example. So it'll be a fun time and lots of interesting things to do.
On that note, thank you, and see you again soon.